Old is new again at the Harvard Art Museums thanks to some very creative use of technology. A conservation team has brought new life to a priceless series of artworks that were thought to be damaged beyond repair some 35 years ago. WGBH News arts editor Jared Bowen has a look back at the origin of these pieces.
Even in 1960, it was a coup when Harvard University landed Mark Rothko to paint a series of murals for its new penthouse dining room. Rothko was already considered one of the country's greatest artists, and this was to be among his biggest commissions.
He really wanted you to be up close and surrounded by his work so that you could feel the painting.
Rothko painted 5 panels to envelop the space. They and the studies and sketches he produced in planning them are now on view in the newly renovated Harvard Art Museum's first special exhibition. The panels were officially installed in 1964, but were in steep competition with the room's Harvard Yard views. The penthouse shades were rarely drawn, and the light-sensitive murals suffered substantial damage.
As the sun would traverse the sky, the paintings became faded and in an uneven way because of the geometry of the room. So some parts were shadowed, some parts received more sunlight. The paintings changed, and so what started off as a unified whole slowly drifted apart.
By 1979, Harvard realized the murals were irreparably damaged and removed them from their dining room perch. And the series, one of only 3 ever painted by Rothko, was placed into storage. And aside from a few exhibitions, it largely disappeared from public view and memory.
It's been an extremely sad thing that this extraordinary work of art has not been included in the art history of Rothko. So it's been a real priority for all of us to bring these works back to a place in which we can study them and recognize the achievement in these extraordinary paintings.
35 years after their removal, Rothko's murals are once again on view, hung in the same configuration, in a room of the same dimensions, and against walls painted the same olive mustard Rothko himself chose.
This really brings them back and puts them in the middle of his entire history in a major way.
Well, Adam, of course, the only way that this could be done was by developing a technology that has never been used before, except for tapestries, but never in paintings, to bring these Rothko murals back to life and back to public view.
How is that technologically possible? How does it work?
It's incredibly scientific. The great fortune here is that Rothko had done a series of studies for these panels, because this really was a major commission for him. As I mentioned in that piece, just one of 3 series that he ever did, and that's why these works are so monumental. So what they did is they looked at these studies, they realized the color that Rothko himself chose, so they had an exact specimen for what the color is. And then they worked with teams from MIT in Switzerland to develop a technology whereby they scanned the paintings basically and created a map pixel by pixel to develop the color, then developed a software, and now it's projected for a certain period of time during the day, and you see the projector here onto the mural, so it recreates the color without actually touching the canvas.
Is that a technique? It sounds incredibly labor intensive. Is that replicable with other works of art that have been compromised over the years?
Well, here's, excuse me, some of the, and here you can see the Narayan Kandekar, who is the lead conservation scientist here, showing what the pixels look like when they're just put in front of a blank board, so you can see how they match the canvas. But to answer your question, the only way this can work, and this is somewhat controversial, and Harvard itself has introduced the controversy. This is a teaching museum, so they want to pose these questions. They also want to answer them. But the only way this can work is because they actually have the specimen. So you can't go to a Renaissance castle somewhere in Europe and necessarily expect something's going to be completely repainted with projections, because you don't necessarily have the original masterpiece or the original studies for the masterpiece from hundreds of years ago.
This is a big deal for Harvard, right? And their art museums. Why is this so significant?
It's significant because the Rothko murals themselves are so significant, and these had largely disappeared from public view. Mary, who also spoke in the piece, spoke about the fact that these had disappeared from public consciousness. There was an exhibition in 1988, which we here at WGBH saw. That's what you're seeing now. But because of concern for the color and the pigmentation, they never wanted to trot them out for public view. And the interesting thing here is that Rothko used a pigment that really shouldn't have been used at the time. It was something he worked with to get this perfect red, but it made it so susceptible to light, which is why it lost its color so quickly, and which was why it was too dangerous to bring it back out into public view. So here you had generations who couldn't even study these pieces.
Just to shift gears, there was some sad news in the art world today. An artist who you interviewed a couple years ago passed away. Tell us about John Wilson.
Yeah, John Wilson is a very significant Boston painter. More than that, he's a very significant painter and sculptor. And in fact, a couple of years ago, when the president had his second inauguration, you might remember that he walked through the Capitol Rotunda and paused at a bust of Martin Luther King Jr., and that was sculpted by John Wilson. I mean, he made some very monumental works that were largely influenced by his life growing up in Roxbury, seeing segregation, seeing racism firsthand, especially what it did to his brother. But I spoke with him, actually I believe it was the first episode of our newly launched Open Studio about Martin Luther King and how he was able to create that bust without actually having seen Martin Luther King in person. Here's what he had to say.
I didn't want to make a simple photographic copy. I wanted to try to get these feelings and ideas that made him what he was.
So tell me a little more about his life story. You mentioned segregation doing something to his brother. What happened to his brother?
Well, he had observed what being in the war and seeing the experience about his brother in suffering segregation in war and how he was treated and how that resonated. And he created some very searing works. I got to know his work through an exhibition by Catherine French, the great recently curator and director of the Danforth Museum in Framingham, who has really been a champion of his and brought these works. You see these early streetscapes he did of Boston that give you a sense of black life then, but then you also see through his eyes the very horrific impact of segregation. And he went on to practice in Europe under Leger, and then he went to Mexico and then came back to the United States. Wow. So he traveled the world and absorbed everything that he saw.
All right, Jared Bowen, thank you. It's fascinating.